College football conferences are incredibly confusing, often contradicting their geography and even their own names. But how and why did we get here? It's a story of cash and of ruthless rivalry. College football dates all the way back to 1869, but of the first 30 years or so, it was completely disorganized. There was no national office like the NCAA today. Some schools played 11 games in a season, while others played 5. The players were not always students either, and the sport became incredibly dangerous. Some 26 players died in the 1892 season alone. In 1895, Purdue president James Henry Smart summoned his counterparts from 6 other Midwestern universities to a meeting in Chicago. A year later, they formed something called the Intercollegiate Conference of Faculty Representatives. It was the conference we know today as the Big Ten. And that began the tradition of college conferences, which for nearly a century remained largely regional. First came the Missouri Valley Intercollegiate Athletic Conference, later known as the Big 8, with schools like Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska. The Southwest Conference, born in 1914, emerged primarily in Texas. Then came the Pacific Coast Conference, a precursor to the Pac-8, then Pac-10, and then Pac-12. The Southern Conference, formed in 1921, would eventually spawn both the SEC and ACC. All of this was occurring at a time when schools still traveled to games by train, so it made sense to align with the closest schools possible. And since most teams played each other every year, heated local rivalries began. Many other universities opted to remain independent in football, most notably Notre Dame. While they followed the rules and regulations of the NCAA, they made their own schedule and brokered their own deals with bowl games. This was what college football looked like for most of the 20th century, until the courts got involved. For decades, the NCAA had controlled all television rights for college football. It restricted how many times a team could appear per season, and money was shared equally among all schools. However, this did not sit well with the big-name programs. In the early 80s, 2 schools, Oklahoma and Georgia, filed an antitrust suit against the NCAA, which rose all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the justices ruled in their favor. With conferences now free to negotiate their own TV deals, the race began to add schools that would increase a league's value at the cost of that locality. The Big Ten struck first in 1990, adding Penn State as its 11th member while, confusingly, not changing its name. The idea of an East Coast university competing against schools as far west as Minnesota and Iowa was so controversial at the time that 3 of the league's own schools voted against it. But now, a precedent was set. Over the next few years, the SEC grew from 10 to 12 schools by adding Arkansas and South Carolina. The ACC landed powerhouse Florida State. The Big East snagged recent national champion Miami. Notre Dame soon became the only major program to remain independent. Most dramatically of all, the Big 8 became the Big 12 by absorbing Southwest Conference members Texas, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and Baylor. The SWC became conference realignment's first major casualty, shutting down after the 1995 season. The conferences have not stopped raiding each other since. In 2003, the ACC stole Miami, Virginia Tech, and Boston College from the Big East, which would not last another decade. In 2010, the league, then known as the Pac-10, very nearly put the Big 12 out of business with an audacious attempt to grab 6 of its schools. All but Colorado opted to stay. Meanwhile, Nebraska, a Big 8 member for more than a century, became the Big 10's 12th member, all in the name of television money. After adding Penn State in the mid-90s, the Big Ten made a deal with ABC worth $10 million a year across all 11 schools. By the time Nebraska joined 15 years later, that number had risen to nearly $20 million per school. That's in part because the league in 2007 launched its own cable network, BTN, a money-printing machine that other conferences would soon try to emulate. The SEC in 2011 grew to 14 schools by adding Missouri and Texas A&M, and soon launched the SEC network. The ACC the same year invited Syracuse and Pittsburgh and would later create the ACC network. West Virginia, meanwhile, escaped the crumbling Big East by joining schools from Texas and the Plain States in the Big 12. And 20 years after its bold Penn State move, the Big Ten looked eastward again to add Rutgers and Maryland, 2 mediocre football programs that happen to be located near New York and Washington, D.C. All was quiet for nearly a decade. Then, in July 2021, a bombshell broke. The SEC was adding Big 12 powerhouses Texas and Oklahoma. Its footprint would now extend from Gainesville, Florida to Norman, Oklahoma. But that was nothing compared to the Big Ten's response a year later. The Chicago-based conference voted to add USC and UCLA, both of them 1,500 miles from the next closest school and on the complete opposite coast from several others. But hey, who needs geography when you can land a $1 billion a year television deal? Losing the LA schools proved to be a nail in the coffin for the Pac-12, which collapsed a year later. Oregon and Washington followed USC and UCLA in the Big Ten. Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah joined the Big 12. Left with no other options, Cal and Stanford joined the Atlantic Coast Conference, whose 14 schools at the time were all in the Eastern time zone. And poor Washington State and Oregon State were left with no home at all. 30 years ago, college football had 7 major conferences. Now, there are just 4.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to the best team of sports writers, reporters, and analysts in the world, offering exclusive stories and unrivaled insight. You could try The Athletic for free for 30 days by clicking the link in the description.